The raven, a grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, ominous bird of yore, at least according to Edgar Allan Poe. I'd like to convince you today that it's also an interesting, innovative, and most importantly, an incredibly intelligent animal. I'm a cognitive biologist, and I study what goes around in the head of an animal, its intelligence. And I'm particularly interested in social cognition. How do they see their social world? How do they see their conspecifics? And how do they act with them? Do they cooperate with them, for example? And what does that tell us about ourselves? What does it tell us about the evolution of human hyper-cooperativeness? That has led, for example, us to build such great cities, where we work together, where we live together. That has led us to build an international space station. To study the evolution of behavior is very difficult, because behavior doesn't leave any fossils. To nonetheless give it a try, we refer to comparisons. We compare our behavior to that of other animals. And our number one go-to animal is, of course, the chimpanzee, our closest living relative. And so did I. I had the privilege and the pleasure to work with Arnhem's famous chimpanzee population at Burgers Zoo. And through endless hours of observation and presenting them with several behavioral tasks, we could show that these animals have personalities, just like us. And moreover, they choose their friends based on these personalities. They choose friends that are similar to them, just as us. So we concluded that most probably our common ancestor that lived about 4 to 13 million years ago must have already had this. They also chose their friends based on their personality. But there we come to a problem. Because if we want to know why these individuals did so, we're lost, because we know very little about these species, about this common ancestor. We don't know nothing about its ecology or its social environment. To answer the why question, we have to broaden our scope and look at, for example, the raven. Our common ancestor lived 320 million years ago. And if we find similar behavior in a raven and in a human, we can be pretty sure that it evolved twice, both in the raven and in the human. Because if the common ancestor already had it, then all descendants of that common ancestor must have had it. And if we take a look at specific highly cognitive capacities, we generally find that most of other animals don't have this. So then we can compare not only the human and the raven with regard to that specific cognitive capacity, but we can also have a look at in which social or ecological environment do these two species live, the human and the raven. And if we find similarities there, we might find an answer why that needed the evolution of intelligence. But why then specifically the raven? Why not look at another bird species? Well, the raven is often associated with death. But it's also, in many cultures and folklore, associated with intelligence. And just to give you an example, the Norse god Odin had two ravens on his shoulders, Hugin and Munin, and these names roughly translate to thought and mind. And if you look up on the internet, if you just go to YouTube, you can find ample examples of intelligent behavior of ravens and playful behavior, etc., etc. Recently, also neuroscientists started backing up our hunches about raven intelligence. And to illustrate that, I want you to have a look at these two skulls. There they are. This is, on the left, a skull of a long-tailed macaque, and on the right, the skull of a raven. The long-tailed macaque is about 5.5 times as heavy as the raven, and actually it weighs 5.5 kilos, and the raven 1. If we look at the brain mass, we see that the difference becomes smaller. The long-tailed macaque has only a 3 times as big brain as the raven. But if we look at what is in that brain, what is the brain packing? Is it just empty space, or is there actual neurons in there? If we count those neurons, we see that the long-tailed macaque only has 1.5 times as many neurons as the raven has. And if we're then going to have a look at where the magic happens, which is for us humans the cortex, and for a raven the pallium, then we see that the raven, this small raven, well, it's a big bird, but if you compare it to a long-tailed macaque, it's relatively small, has more neurons there than that long-tailed macaque. And it's not that I want to say that neural count equals intelligence. But I think we can agree that you need a little bit of a brain to be intelligent. To study their intelligence, we study their behavior. We give them tasks to solve and see whether they can or cannot solve these tasks. And to do so, we keep them in our lab, which is not as sterile as you might think. And there we have these birds and we have personal relationships with these birds because that allows us to test them in the paradigms we want to test them, as you can see here. And if you look very carefully, they're trying to steal food from my jacket. So they're not always that nice. But we don't only study them in the lab, we also study them in the field, in a valley in the Austrian Alps, in the Grüner Almtal, where a combination of wing and leg marks allows us to recognize about 200 of these ravens. And there we can see how they use this intelligence in their daily life. So in the lab, we could show that ravens can spontaneously cooperate in what is called the loose string paradigm, what you see over here. You see there is a platform, and what you probably cannot see because it's very little on this platform are 2 pieces of cheese. Again, mythology meets the truth, because indeed ravens love cheese. So the platform, however, is out of reach for the ravens, so they need to get it into reach. And my colleague is now going to put in some strings, and only when they pull these strings simultaneously, they will pull the platform towards them. Because if only one raven pulls the string, it's left with the string in the beak rather than with a piece of cheese. And as you can see, they really quickly solve this task. It's very easy for them. But what you can also see is that the raven on the right actually cheated, because it stole the piece of cheese of the raven on the left. And it's not something only you see, the ravens themselves see that too, and they act upon it. If they're being cheated upon, they will not cooperate with that individual in the next trial. If you give them the choice with whom they can cooperate, if they could choose between 2 individuals with whom to cooperate, they will always first go for their friend. And from the wild, we know that these friendships, these cooperative friendships, are very important for ravens. Ravens in the wild are constantly bickering and fighting about stuff, like you can see here. But the chances to win such a fight increases drastically when you have a friend around. But it's not just important to have a friend, it's also to know who are the friends of your enemies, because you don't want to pick a fight with somebody who has 10 friends around him. And the ravens know this. Back in the lab, we could show that ravens actually have mental representations, just like we have, about the relationships of others. So who's befriended with whom, who outranks whom, etc., etc. And back in the field, we could show that they use such information politically. That is, ravens build such relationships just like us by being nice to each other. They spend time with each other and they caress each other. And for ravens, that is called preening, as you see here. And that's an obvious behavior. We can see it, but ravens can see it too. Ravens that already have a strong relationship and are at the top of the hierarchy, they monitor other ravens. And as soon as they see that some 2 birds try and make an alliance, they come in between. They prevent them from building this alliance and becoming future competitors. And it's this political behavior that is so much in common to our political behavior that has led us to think that has led to the evolution of intelligence. Because just like us humans, ravens live in complex social environments in which there is a constant struggle for power, and only if you think strategically, you can get ahead of the rest. That is not to say that politics always equals intelligence. But as I mentioned before, we should not always compare ourselves to monkeys, because to truly understand the evolution of intelligence, we have to broaden our horizons and look at much more distantly related species. Thank you very much.